My name is Calantha Jones, and I am 29 years old. Exactly 2 hours after we buried my grandfather, my adoptive mother threw my life out of a second-story window. I stood on the driveway in my black morning dress and watched an antique porcelain vase shatter into 100 pieces across the concrete. It landed right next to the heavy-duty garbage bags holding everything I owned. My adoptive father stood on the front steps, checked his watch, and told me I was not blood, so I got nothing. He locked the iron gates of his $8 million Tiburon estate, leaving me on the wet curb with a box of old appraisal tools and $400 to my name. He thought he won. What he did not know was that my phone was about to ring, and the woman on the other end was a senior wealth manager at Pacific Century Bank, holding the keys to a $114 million empire. Before I tell you what that bank manager said, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories. Do this only if my story hits close to home for you. Also, drop your age in the comments right now. I always wonder what age you have to be to finally realize that family is a choice, not a bloodline. Now, let me take you back to that foggy Tuesday afternoon in Marin County and the exact moment my father showed me who he really was. The Marin County fog was thick that day, dampening the wool of my dress. I was still clutching the funeral program. Grandpa Harrison, the man who founded a commercial real estate dynasty, was gone. He was the only person in that house who ever treated me like a human being after my adoptive mother died and Richard remarried Beatrice. Now I was standing outside the front door, watching Beatrice hurl another trash bag off the balcony. It hit the hood of my rusted 2014 Toyota Corolla. Richard was ignoring me. He was pacing near the garage, barking into his cell phone. I could hear every word. He told his assistant to call the funeral caterers and force them to hold the final check until Friday. He said to just post-date the $10,000 and make it happen. It was a strange command for a man standing in front of an $8 million house, but I filed it away in my mind. Richard hung up the phone, rubbed his temples, and finally looked at me. His eyes were cold, stripped of the fake grief he wore at the cemetery. He walked down the steps and stood over me. He said Harrison is gone and the charity case is closed. He told me I was not blood. I had no place in his family, and I needed to lose the address. Over his shoulder, I saw my stepsister Olivia leaning against her pristine white Tesla. She had her phone out, the recording light blinking red. She was framing my humiliation for her hundreds of thousands of followers, whispering to the camera about cutting out toxic energy. I did not scream. I did not drop to my knees and beg. As a historic property appraiser, Grandpa Harrison taught me how to tell the difference between polish and rot. This family was rotting from the inside out. I bent down and gathered my scattered belongings. My hand brushed against my appraisal kit, and my fingers wrapped tightly around my specialized UV light pen. I zipped the bag shut, dragged the garbage sacks toward my trunk, and sat down on the cold, wet curb. The heavy iron gates clicked shut behind me, sealing them inside their fortress. The silence of the street felt heavy. Then, my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. The screen lit up with an unknown San Francisco number. I swiped to answer, and a sharp, precise voice on the other end asked if I was safe and alone. The phone vibrated against my damp thigh. I stared at the screen. It was an unknown number with a San Francisco area code. My hands were freezing, numb from the coastal fog, but I swiped the green icon anyway. I held the phone to my ear, expecting a telemarketer, or maybe a final cruelty from Richard's assistant. Instead, a woman's voice cut through the static. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not offer condolences. Her tone was sharp, precise, and entirely devoid of pity. She asked if I was safe and if I was alone. I looked back at the wrought iron gates of the Tiburon estate, sealing me out of the only home I had known for 20 years. I told her I was sitting on the curb next to garbage bags. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Evelyn Reed, Senior Wealth Manager at Pacific Century Bank. Before she continued, I heard a distinct, heavy, metallic click echoing through her headset. It sounded exactly like the locking mechanism of a high-grade corporate vault. Evelyn said my grandfather anticipated my father's actions today. She said he left explicit instructions in the event of his passing, and I needed to come to the financial district immediately for an emergency trust activation meeting. I hung up the phone. The tears that had been threatening to spill finally stopped. Confusion replaced the despair. Grandpa Harrison had always protected me from the worst of Richard and Beatrice, but he was a man of few words. He built Harrison Heritage Group from a single storefront in San Jose into a commercial real estate juggernaut covering half of Silicon Valley. We used to walk through empty commercial lots together. He taught me how to appraise properties, how to check the foundation before looking at the crown molding. He always told me that true value is buried in the load-bearing walls, not the fresh coat of paint. But he never talked about his personal estate. I thought he left everything to Richard. Everyone did. That was why Richard was so quick to throw me out. He thought he owned the kingdom. I stood up, brushed the wet leaves off my black morning dress, and grabbed the trash bags. I shoved them into the back seat of my 12-year-old Corolla. The engine sputtered before roaring to life, a stark contrast to the silent electric vehicles parked behind the gates. I drove toward the Golden Gate Bridge. The fog began to lift as I crossed the water, revealing the steel and glass skyline of San Francisco. During the drive, my mind raced through the legal realities of wealth management in California. In my line of work, you learn a lot about property transfers and estate law. If Grandpa left a standard will, it would go to probate court. Probate is public, messy, and painfully slow. Richard would tie it up for years using expensive corporate lawyers, starving out anyone who contested the filings until they settled for pennies. But Evelyn used the word trust. A trust bypasses probate entirely. It operates in the shadows, outside the public record, managed by a trustee until a specific triggering event occurs. Death was a triggering event. Pacific Century Bank was located on Montgomery Street, housed inside a towering skyscraper of mirrored glass. I handed my keys to the valet, acutely aware of my scuffed shoes and the damp hem of my dress. The lobby was a sanctuary of polished marble and hushed conversations. I approached the reception desk and gave my name. The concierge did not ask for identification. He nodded, pressed a button under his desk, and escorted me to a private elevator requiring a biometric scan. We ascended to the 42nd floor. The doors opened into an immaculate suite overlooking the bay. Evelyn Reed was waiting for me. She was a formidable woman in her late 50s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, her silver hair pulled back into a severe twist. She did not offer me coffee or water. She gestured to a leather chair across from a heavy mahogany desk. I sat down, clutching my purse. Evelyn opened a thick leather-bound portfolio. She looked at me, her eyes assessing my posture, my worn clothes, the remnants of grief on my face. She said Harrison chose well. I asked her what she meant by that. Evelyn folded her hands on the desk. She explained that my grandfather did not just leave a simple will. He knew Richard was reckless. He knew Richard was obsessed with appearances and bleeding cash to maintain his social standing among the Bay Area elite. Harrison structured a secret blind trust. A blind trust gives the beneficiary no knowledge of the assets while the grantor is alive, preventing any interference or manipulation. Now that Harrison was gone, the blindfold was coming off. Evelyn turned the portfolio around and slid it toward me. The documents were dense, filled with financial jargon, but my eyes caught the bottom line. The trust controlled 60% of the voting shares for Harrison Heritage Group. It was not a small cash inheritance or a secondary property. It was a controlling interest. I scanned the valuation column. The numbers blurred for a second before snapping into focus. $114 million. I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at the itemized list. The commercial high-rises in downtown San Jose, the tech campuses in Mountain View, the retail complexes in Palo Alto. I owned the company. I owned the buildings. I owned the ground Richard stood on. Evelyn did not let me sit in the shock for long. She tapped her manicured fingernail against a specific clause highlighted in yellow. She warned me that assuming control of a corporate entity of this magnitude was not as simple as signing a piece of paper. There was a legal catch. Harrison wanted to ensure I had the strength to actually wield the power he was giving me. To formally activate the trust and transfer the voting rights into my name, I had to execute a formal audit notice and serve it directly to the current acting chief executive officer. That was Richard. The clause had a strict expiration date. I had 48 hours from the time of Harrison's death to serve the notice. Evelyn explained the stakes with clinical precision. If I failed to meet that deadline, the activation would default. The shares would be absorbed by the board of directors, and Richard commanded the board. He would distribute the shares to his allies and dilute my inheritance down to nothing. My father would retain complete control, and I would be left with exactly what he gave me on the driveway. Nothing. I sat back in the leather chair. The cold reality of the situation washed over me. I was no longer a grieving granddaughter trying to figure out where to sleep tonight. I was the majority shareholder of a corporate empire, and I was on the clock. My grandfather had handed me a loaded weapon, but I was the one who had to pull the trigger. I wiped the last remaining tear from my cheek. I asked Evelyn for a pen. I signed the preliminary acknowledgement forms, securing the temporary freeze on the board's voting rights. The rush of vindication was intoxicating. A sudden surge of power after a lifetime of feeling small. But as Evelyn handed me the official audit notice sealed in a thick manila envelope, I knew the real war was only just beginning. I had to walk into the lion's den and look the man who threw me away right in the eye. 2 days later, the morning sun reflected off the towering glass skyscrapers of the San Francisco financial district, casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement. The clock was ticking down to the final hours of my deadline. I parked my rusted Toyota in a pricey underground garage, knowing the hourly rate would eat into the $400 I had left to my name. I took the elevator up to the 42nd floor of Sterling & Partners, a premier corporate law firm that handled the estates of Silicon Valley elites. The air inside the reception area smelled of lemon polish and expensive espresso. I smoothed the wrinkles out of my sensible gray blazer, clutching my leather bag tightly. Inside that bag was the sealed manila envelope containing the formal audit notice Evelyn Reed had prepared. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands were steady. I was walking into a trap they did not know existed. A junior associate guided me down a long corridor lined with modern art, eventually opening a set of heavy mahogany doors. The conference room was vast, dominated by a polished wooden table that stretched out like an airport runway. The family was already seated, basking in the glow of their impending wealth. They treated this solemn legal proceeding like a VIP waiting room before a luxury shopping spree. Olivia sat near the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathed in natural light. Her thumbs tapped rhythmically across the glowing screen of her smartphone. I glanced over and saw she was casually browsing the Cartier website, zooming in on a rose gold timepiece encrusted with diamonds. It was a $15,000 watch. She did not even look up when I entered the room. Beatrice sat next to her, draped in pristine white cashmere. When the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind me, Beatrice turned her head. Her eyes swept up and down my discounted slacks and scuffed shoes. She let out a soft, breathy scoff. She leaned over to Richard and whispered loud enough for the entire room to hear, questioning why the charity case was allowed inside the building. She assumed I was there to beg for a handout, perhaps hoping the lawyers would toss me a few $1,000s out of pity, just to make me disappear. Richard sat at the head of the table, a position he claimed by sheer arrogance. He wore a tailored navy suit that likely cost more than my car. He was busy reviewing a quarterly earnings report on his tablet, acting as though the transfer of a corporate empire was merely a minor administrative hurdle in his busy day. He did not acknowledge my presence. He thought he had already won the war on the driveway. Thomas Sterling, a senior partner at the firm, stepped into the room carrying a thick leather binder. He took his seat, adjusted his reading glasses, and cleared his throat. He read the standard legal preamble, confirming the passing of Harrison Jones. The room grew quiet. save for the soft tapping of Olivia scrolling on her phone. Sterling moved directly to the physical assets distributed outside the primary corporate trust. He announced that the Tiburon estate, the luxurious $8 million property I was exiled from just 48 hours prior, was formally transferred to Richard. Richard offered a tight, self-satisfied nod, crossing his arms over his chest. Next, Sterling read the terms of a supplementary fund. Olivia was granted a conditional trust account designed to yield a lucrative monthly dividend, provided the parent company remained solvent. Olivia finally looked away from the diamond watch on her screen, flashing a brilliant, hollow smile. They were getting exactly what they expected. The world was spinning on its usual axis, rewarding the polished and ignoring the rot. Then, Sterling turned a page. The crisp sound of the thick legal paper seemed to echo in the silent room. He stated that the remaining assets, including the intellectual property, the operational licenses, and the central holding company known as Harrison Heritage Group, were bound by a distinct blind trust. He adjusted his glasses again, his tone shifting to a serious, deliberate cadence. He read the final directive. He stated that 100% of the blind trust, carrying 60% of the corporate voting shares, was transferred immediately and irrevocably to Calantha Jones. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Olivia dropped her phone. The device clattered loudly against the polished mahogany, the bright image of the Cartier watch sliding across the wood. Beatrice gasped, her manicured hand flying to her throat as if she had been physically struck. The color drained from Richard's face, leaving him pale and gaunt, before a dangerous, mottled crimson rushed back into his cheeks. He gripped the edge of the heavy table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. He opened his mouth to shout, but I did not give him the chance. I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick manila envelope. I slid it across the smooth surface of the table. It glided effortlessly, stopping mere inches from his trembling hands. I kept my voice cool and level. I told him that was his formal audit notice, served within the 48-hour deadline, activating my shares effective immediately. Richard stared at the envelope like it was a venomous snake. For a brief second, I saw genuine panic in his eyes. He realized he had been outmaneuvered from beyond the grave by the man he just buried. But Richard did not build a reputation in Silicon Valley by surrendering. He was still the acting chief executive officer, and he knew how to wield corporate machinery like a weapon. He stood up, towering over the table, his tailored suit suddenly looking like armor. He did not threaten to trap the estate in probate court. As an experienced businessman, he knew a blind trust bypassed that lengthy public process entirely. Instead, he pivoted to a much more vicious strategy. He pointed a finger directly at my chest and snarled. He declared that I was not walking away with his company. He stated he was leaving this room and going directly to a superior court judge to file an emergency injunction. His voice rose, bouncing off the glass walls. He accused me of elder abuse. He claimed I had exerted undue influence over a dying, vulnerable man to manipulate the legal documents in my favor. It was a vile, baseless lie. But in the realm of corporate litigation, truth is often secondary to the speed of an accusation. Richard smiled, and it was a cold, predatory expression. He vowed to freeze the trust accounts pending a federal-level investigation. He explained the mechanics of his trap with dark pleasure. Until the judge dismissed the injunction, which could take months or even years, I would not be able to access a single dollar of the $114 million. He leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. He reminded me that he had the corporate treasury at his disposal to hire an army of ruthless litigators. I, on the other hand, had a rusty car and whatever loose change was sitting in my checking account. He promised to bleed me dry in legal fees before I ever saw the inside of the executive boardroom. He told me I would be bankrupt, sleeping on the streets, and begging him to drop the charges by the end of the month. Richard grabbed his coat, signaled for Beatrice and Olivia to follow, and stormed out of the conference room. The heavy doors slammed shut, leaving me alone with the executor. My heart sank. Holding a piece of paper meant nothing if the billionaire chief executive officer locked the vault. I served the notice, but the victory was hollow. I was facing a war of attrition, and my bank account was running on fumes. I had to figure out a way to survive the financial freeze, and I had to find a cheap place to sleep tonight before his lawyers filed the paperwork tomorrow morning. The Pacific Coast wind rattled the thin glass of my $80 a night motel room in Daly City. It was a stark contrast to the climate-controlled perfection of the Tiburon estate I had been exiled from just 3 days prior. The air smelled faintly of stale smoke and industrial cleaner. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the flickering neon vacancy sign buzzing outside the window. The heavy manila envelope containing the formal audit notice sat on the cheap laminate desk, a physical reminder of the empire I legally owned but could not touch. Richard's threat echoed in my mind. He promised to freeze the trust, to bleed me dry with an emergency injunction, and he was a man who delivered on his promises. I had $400 left in my bank account. That might cover a week in this room and a few trips to the grocery store. I needed a strategy, and I needed it fast, before his army of litigators filed the paperwork to cut off my oxygen entirely. Before I could map out a survival plan, 3 sharp knocks rapped against the hollow wooden door. The sound startled me. I was not expecting anyone. My heart jumped into my throat. Perhaps Richard had already sent his lawyers to serve me with the injunction papers. I walked over and peered through the scratched peephole. Standing on the exterior walkway, flanked by peeling paint and flickering fluorescent bulbs, were Beatrice and Olivia. They looked entirely out of place, like 2 exotic birds dropped into a concrete parking garage. Beatrice wore a beige trench coat draped over her shoulders, her blonde hair perfectly blown out despite the aggressive ocean wind. Olivia stood slightly behind her, clutching a designer handbag, her eyes darting nervously at the other motel doors, as if expecting a mugger to jump out at any second. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open just wide enough to stand in the frame. I did not invite them inside. Beatrice offered a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. It was a practiced, plastic expression of sympathy, the kind she used at charity galas when writing a check for a cause she cared nothing about. She held up a small white cardboard box tied with a thin piece of red string. It was a box of generic assorted pastries from a discount supermarket chain. The gesture was incredibly telling. This was the woman who routinely ordered imported French macarons for her weekly book club meetings. Bringing me stale bulk bakery goods was a calculated insult, a physical manifestation of her utter lack of respect for my existence. Beatrice shifted her weight, her heels clicking against the concrete walkway. She adopted a tone of maternal concern, dropping her voice to a soft, breathy whisper. She claimed the entire situation at the firm was a terrible misunderstanding. She said Richard was simply overcome with grief, acting out of pain rather than malice. She insisted the eviction was a temporary lapse in judgment and that they wanted to make things right. Olivia chimed in, nodding enthusiastically, suggesting I could move back into the small pool house on the Tiburon property until everything was sorted out. The pool house was where they stored the patio furniture during the winter. It was a clear demotion, an attempt to put me back in a box they controlled. I stared at them, absorbing the performance. If I had not spent my life watching them manipulate everyone around them, I might have believed the act. But growing up in the shadow of Richard and Beatrice was an advanced course in psychological warfare. They were masters of the reconciliation call, the kind where they offered a tiny sliver of warmth to lull you into compliance. They realized a brutal legal battle would be expensive and messy, potentially drawing unwanted attention from the board of directors. They needed a cheaper, cleaner solution. They needed me to surrender quietly. I opened the door a few more inches, gesturing toward the small laminate table near the window. I told them to come inside and state their business. Beatrice stepped into the room, her nose wrinkling slightly at the smell of stale smoke. Olivia followed, refusing to let go of her expensive handbag. Beatrice set the box of cheap pastries on the table, ignoring the lone desk lamp illuminating the room. She reached into her trench coat pocket and retrieved a manila folder, much thinner than the one I received from the bank. She slid it across the table toward me. She called it a management agreement, a mutually beneficial arrangement to stabilize the company during this difficult transition. She explained that running a corporate empire like Harrison Heritage Group required specialized expertise, something I simply did not possess. She proposed a compromise. If I signed the document granting Richard full operational authority and signing over my voting rights, he would immediately authorize a $100,000 allowance from the corporate treasury. I would have financial security, a place to live, and no legal battles. It sounded like a lifeline to someone drowning in poverty. I picked up the folder and opened it. My background as an appraiser trained me to spot hidden flaws. When evaluating a historic property, the real danger is never the peeling paint. It is the dry rot hidden behind the baseboards. I applied that same scrutiny to the legal jargon filling the pages. The document was not a temporary management agreement. It was an irrevocable proxy transfer. It contained a specific clause embedded deep within the fourth page, stipulating that by accepting the allowance, I waived my right to contest any future corporate decisions made by the acting chief executive officer. It was a permanent muzzle. They were trying to buy a $114 million empire for the price of a mid-sized luxury sedan. I looked up from the document, meeting Beatrice's gaze. The plastic sympathy was still plastered across her face, but I saw the calculating gleam in her eyes. She thought I was desperate enough to take the bait. She thought the threat of the injunction and the reality of this dingy motel room would break my spirit. She underestimated the resilience built from 20 years of being the family outcast. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse her of trying to steal my inheritance. I simply closed the folder and slid it back across the laminate table. It hit the box of cheap pastries with a soft thud. I looked Beatrice right in the eye, maintaining a cool, steady tone. I told her that Grandpa Harrison always taught me never to sign the first offer on a distressed property. The fake smile vanished from Beatrice's face, replaced by a tight, rigid fury. The mask slipped completely, revealing the cold, calculating woman I had known my entire life. Olivia gasped, stepping back toward the door as if she expected me to become physically violent. Beatrice snatched the folder off the table, her knuckles white. She warned me that I was making a catastrophic mistake. She said Richard offered an olive branch, and I just snapped it in half. She promised that when the lawyers were finished with me, I would be begging for that $100,000. I walked over to the door and pulled it open, gesturing for them to leave. I told them to send the lawyers. Beatrice and Olivia marched out of the room, their heels echoing sharply against the concrete walkway. I closed the door and threw the deadbolt. The psychological warfare had failed. They tried to buy my silence, and I refused the transaction. But as I watched their luxury SUV pull out of the motel parking lot, a new wave of dread washed over me. I had forced their hand. By rejecting the quiet surrender, I guaranteed they would pursue a much louder, more destructive path. If they could not manipulate me in private, they would destroy my reputation in public, targeting the only thing I had left to lose. The silence in my cheap motel room felt heavier after Beatrice and Olivia left. I locked the deadbolt, leaned against the thin wooden door, and let out a long breath. They failed to buy my surrender with their insulting $100,000 allowance, but I knew the wealthy never simply walk away from a lost negotiation. They regroup. They find a different angle to apply pressure. I expected Richard to accelerate his legal strategy, perhaps sending process servers to pound on my door before sunrise. I prepared myself for a courtroom battle. What I did not expect was a coordinated strike on my public reputation, executed with surgical precision on a digital battlefield where I had no defenses. Around 9 o'clock that evening, my cell phone began to vibrate on the laminate nightstand. It was not a single phone call. It was a rapid, unending sequence of notifications. Text messages from former college classmates I had not spoken to in years. Direct messages from casual acquaintances. Alerts from professional networking platforms. I picked up the device and unlocked the screen. A colleague from the Historic Preservation Society had sent me a link with a single question asking what was going on. I clicked the link. It opened a video on a popular social media app, and the blood drained from my face. It was a fresh post from Olivia. Over the past 5 years, my stepsister had built a lucrative lifestyle brand online, funded entirely by Richard's corporate credit cards. She marketed herself as a self-made wellness guru and interior design expert, curating an audience of 400,000 affluent followers. Those followers hung on to her every word, buying the expensive supplements and silk pillowcases she promoted. Now, she was using that vast, loyal audience to destroy me. The video was a masterclass in digital manipulation. Olivia sat on the floor of her pristine, sunlit living room. She wore an oversized beige knit sweater designed to make her look fragile and small. A soft ring light illuminated her face, catching the deliberate, single tear rolling down her cheek. A melancholy, slow piano track played softly in the background, setting a somber, cinematic mood. She looked directly into the camera lens, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. She told her followers she was filming this during the darkest week of her life. She explained that she just buried her beloved grandfather. Then, the pivot happened. She claimed her family was currently being victimized by a predatory, estranged step-sibling. She never used my name, but she provided enough specific details about Marin County and the estate structure that anyone in our Silicon Valley social circle would immediately know exactly who she meant. Olivia spun a harrowing tale. She said this estranged sibling isolated their grandfather during his final months, taking advantage of his declining cognitive health to steal the family business. She looked down at her hands, sobbing quietly, whispering that it was terrifying to see how greed could turn a person into a monster. I sat on the sagging motel bed watching the video loop 3 times. It already had 100,000 views. I scrolled through the comments section. The response was a swift digital mob execution. Thousands of strangers were expressing their outrage, calling for my arrest, demanding to know my identity so they could warn others. Prominent investors, local real estate developers, and wealthy socialites who ran in Richard's circle were sharing the post, adding their own disgusted commentary. It was an orchestrated smear campaign. By portraying herself as the victim, Olivia was systematically dismantling my character in the public square. They knew I legally controlled the trust, so they decided to make me too toxic to actually run the company. I did not sleep that night. I watched the view count climb, feeling a suffocating sense of helplessness. The next morning, I put on my best tailored suit. I needed to project strength. I drove my rusted Toyota across the bridge into San Francisco, heading to the boutique appraisal firm where I worked. I had spent 6 years building my career there. I never used the Harrison family name or Richard's connections. I earned my position by spending thousands of hours crawling through the dusty attics of Victorian mansions, authenticating original crown molding and saving historical registries. My professional reputation was the only thing I truly owned. When I walked through the glass double doors of the firm, the atmosphere was freezing. The receptionist, who normally greeted me with a warm smile, quickly averted her eyes and pretended to type on her keyboard. The hushed whispers and the open concept bullpen stopped the second my heels clicked against the hardwood floor. Before I could even reach my desk, the director of human resources stepped out of her office. She asked me to join her in the senior partner's boardroom. The senior partner was waiting for us. He was a pragmatic man who valued discretion above all else in our high net worth industry. He motioned for me to sit down. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He slid a printed screenshot of Olivia's viral video across the polished mahogany table. He told me the firm received 4 separate phone calls this morning from our most lucrative clients. Those clients were threatening to pull their upcoming appraisal contracts. They recognized the thinly veiled accusations in the video, and they did not want their historic properties associated with someone accused of elder abuse and financial fraud. I tried to explain. I kept my voice steady, stating the video was a coordinated lie designed to force my hand in a private probate dispute. I told them my grandfather left me, the parent company, in a blind trust, and my family was retaliating. The senior partner sighed, rubbing his temples. He said he believed my character, but the firm operated on optics and trust. A historic property appraiser must be beyond reproach. He explained that until this situation was legally resolved and my name was cleared in the public eye, they could not risk their client relationships. The human resources director handed me a formal letter. I was being placed on unpaid administrative leave, effective immediately. I was asked to hand over my corporate security badge and clear my personal belongings from my desk by the end of the hour. It was a swift, clinical severing of ties. The one independent lifeline I built with my own 2 hands was gone, snatched away by a fake tear and a sad piano track. I surrendered my plastic badge, placed my few desk items into a small cardboard box, and walked out of the building. The walk back to the parking garage felt like wading through deep water. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, staring at the concrete wall. I had no income. I had no home. My legal deadline to fight Richard's impending injunction was approaching, and my bank account held a few $100s. I pulled out my phone and opened the social media app. The video was still gaining traction. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The urge to type a response, to defend myself, to scream the truth into the comments section was overwhelming. Have you ever watched someone lie about you to a room full of people who eagerly believed it? If you have, you know the specific kind of suffocation it brings. You know the desperate urge to correct the narrative, to present the facts to a crowd that has already decided you are the villain. Drop a yes in the comments if you understand that exact feeling of helplessness. I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. Then, I closed the application and locked the phone. Engaging in a digital shouting match with an influencer was a losing battle. Olivia controlled that arena. She had the followers, the lighting, and the curated aesthetic. If I posted a rebuttal from the front seat of a 12-year-old sedan, I would only look unhinged and guilty. Grandpa Harrison did not leave me an empire because he thought I could win a popularity contest. He chose me because I knew how to inspect a foundation. Appraisers do not deal in rumors or social media narratives. We deal in tangible evidence. We deal in structural integrity and documented history. I realized I could not fight this smear campaign with an internet comment. I needed to fight it with cold, hard paper. Richard was projecting an image of the grieving, responsible patriarch, but his desperation to freeze the trust told a different story. The holding company was hiding something terrible. I started the engine of my car. I was done waiting in a motel room for their next attack. It was time to physically inspect the rot. I pulled out of the parking garage and merged onto the highway, driving south toward San Jose. The midday traffic was light. I rolled down the window of my Corolla, letting the sharp coastal air clear the stagnation from my lungs. Losing my job was a heavy blow, but it also stripped away the final layer of hesitation. I had no professional reputation left to protect. Richard and Olivia took it. Now, my only objective was dismantling the false reality they built. I reached onto the passenger seat and pulled a thick stack of printed balance sheets from my bag. Evelyn Reed provided these financial summaries during our meeting at the bank. I spent the last 2 nights staring at the numbers in my motel room, searching for anomalies. On paper, Richard managed a dozen highly lucrative commercial sites, but one specific project in the South Bay caught my attention. It was designated as the crown jewel of his recent portfolio, a mixed-use tech campus slated for completion last year. The record showed continuous, heavy capital injections for premium materials and specialized labor. Yet, the property generated 0 revenue. It was listed as perpetually under construction. I exited the freeway and navigated the sprawling suburban streets until I reached the address. I parked my rusted car a block away and walked the rest of the distance. When the site came into view, the discrepancy between the accounting reports and physical reality was stark. The spreadsheet described a bustling, near-finished tech hub. My eyes saw a ghost town. Chain link fences surrounded the perimeter, choked with overgrown weeds. The structural steel framing jutted into the sky, already showing streaks of orange rust from exposure to the elements. There were no cement trucks, no hard hats, no sounds of active labor. It was a dead zone. A faded plastic sign hung crookedly on the gate, boasting the Harrison Heritage Group logo. Grandpa would never tolerate a site looking this neglected. I walked along the perimeter until I found a gap where the fence was pulled away from its concrete anchor. I slipped through, my suit jacket catching slightly on the sharp wire. The ground was uneven, littered with discarded soda cans and faded warning tape. My destination was a rectangular aluminum trailer sitting near the foundation pour. It served as the on-site management office. I approached the metal door and inspected the handle. The padlock securing the latch was a cheap, generic brand you could buy at any hardware store. A project boasting a 9-figure budget should possess biometric security or, at minimum, a private guard. This site had a lock I could defeat with a standard tension wrench from my appraisal kit. I pulled the small metal tool from my pocket, inserted it into the keyhole, and applied steady pressure. The cylinder turned with a satisfying click. I removed the padlock, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped inside the stifling heat of the trailer. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of hot plastic. Sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, illuminating rows of metal filing cabinets and drafting tables scattered with curled blueprints. I walked over to the nearest table and dropped my bag. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out Evelyn's documents. I needed the corresponding physical files to prove why the digital numbers felt wrong. I moved to the filing cabinets and began pulling drawers. My hands worked quickly, sorting through employee timesheets, municipal zoning permits, and material receipts. I found the master folder labeled Vendor Contracts. I carried it to the drafting table and spread the paperwork out next to the bank ledgers. I started cross-referencing the payments. According to the bank, Richard authorized millions of dollars in wire transfers to 3 specific construction contractors for premium structural steel and foundation work. I located the corresponding bills in the physical folder. At first glance, everything looked legitimate. The pages featured professional letterheads, itemized billing codes, and authorized signatures. They matched the bank records down to the final cent. A casual auditor would review these files, tick a box, and approve the expenditure. But I was not a corporate accountant. I was a historic property appraiser. I spent my career verifying authenticity. I knew that the best forgeries always focus on the math, assuming the inspector will ignore the paper. I reached into my appraisal kit and retrieved my specialized UV light pen. It was the same tool I gripped on the driveway when Richard threw me out. In my profession, we use ultraviolet light to expose repairs on antique canvas or detect modern synthetic dyes in vintage rugs. It also reveals the hidden security features embedded in official government documents and certified notary seals. I clicked the button on the top of the pen. A sharp, narrow beam of purple light illuminated the dusty surface of the drafting table. I hovered the light over the first construction permit, focusing on the embossed notary stamp verifying the contractor's legal operating status. A genuine California notary seal contains specific microprinting and UV reactive ink that fluoresces brightly under ultraviolet inspection. The seal on Richard's document remained dull and lifeless. I moved the pen across the page, checking the watermarks on the premium steel invoices. True corporate watermarks are pressed into the paper fibers during manufacturing. When I shined the purple beam through the back of the invoice, the watermark did not show the varied density of pressed paper. It was a flat, uniform layer of gray ink. They were cheap, printed fakes. The contractors did not exist. The premium steel was never purchased. The labor was never performed. I felt a cold rush of adrenaline course through my veins. I grabbed the next billing statement, and then the next. Every single high-dollar contract tied to this stalled tech campus was a fabrication. I traced the routing numbers listed at the bottom of the fake documents. They all funneled into a single holding account. I pulled out my phone and accessed the state business registry, typing in the routing details. The search results populated on my screen, revealing the true recipient of the millions of dollars bleeding out of Harrison Heritage Group. The entity was registered as Tiburon Holdings, LLC. The name was a brazen, arrogant choice. Richard was not just losing money through bad investments. He was actively embezzling it. He fabricated phantom construction companies, approved their invoices as the chief executive officer, and wired the cash directly into his own private shell company. I looked back at Evelyn's ledgers, tracing the origin of the dispersed funds. The money was not coming from surplus profits. Richard was draining the employee pension funds to cover his tracks. He was stealing the retirement savings of the foremen, the architects, and the administrative staff who spent decades building Grandpa's legacy. He funneled their futures into Tiburon Holdings, LLC, and then used that shell company to pay his personal creditors, maintain Beatrice's country club memberships, and fund Olivia's entire online lifestyle brand. Richard believed the shell company was perfectly hidden behind layers of corporate bureaucracy. He assumed the board of directors would never authorize a physical inspection of a site that looked functional on a spreadsheet. He certainly never expected the outcast daughter, the one he deemed unworthy of his bloodline, to walk into a dusty trailer and dismantle his intricate fraud with a purple flashlight. I stood in the sweltering heat of the aluminum office, staring at the fake notary seals. Grandpa Harrison handed me a blind trust, but this physical evidence was the real inheritance. I now possessed the shovel Richard used to dig his own grave. I gathered the forged contracts and stuffed them securely into my leather bag. I had enough proof to send my father to federal prison for a very long time. But I knew a cornered animal is the most dangerous. If I presented this evidence now, his high-priced litigators would stall, claim administrative errors, and bury the truth under years of legal motions. I needed an inescapable trap, a venue where he could not deflect the blame. As I walked out of the trailer and locked the cheap padlock behind me, I thought about his impending injunction. He was terrified of me touching the corporate assets. But his lawyers were also spending tens of thousands of dollars fiercely guarding the physical deed to the Tiburon mansion. It was a strange, frantic allocation of resources. If Richard owned the house free and clear, as stated in the will, why was he fortifying the paperwork for the deed right now? He was guarding that specific door with everything he had, which meant he was hiding a second, even larger secret behind it. I needed to find out who truly owned the ground he slept on. I drove back to Daly City with the forged vendor contracts securely zipped inside my leather bag. The adrenaline from breaking into the construction trailer began to fade, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I had the evidence to send my adoptive father to prison. But releasing it prematurely would allow his legal team to frame it as an administrative oversight. I needed to understand his defense strategy before launching my offensive. I sat at the cheap laminate desk in my motel room, opened my laptop, and accessed the secure digital portal Evelyn Reed had set up for me. The portal contained real-time updates on the corporate treasury and any pending legal motions filed by the acting chief executive officer. I clicked on the latest expense reports. Richard was burning through corporate cash at an alarming rate, paying exorbitant retainers to a notoriously ruthless litigation firm in San Francisco. One particular line item caught my eye. It was a $40,000 expedited legal fee, coded under personal asset protection. I opened the attached invoice. His high-priced litigators were filing rapid-fire motions in county court, requesting emergency seals and expedited title transfers, specifically for the physical deed to the Tiburon mansion. I leaned back in the creaking motel chair and studied the invoice. Richard was terrified. He assumed that because he threw me out of that house, my primary objective was to take it back. He believed I wanted the master suite, the sweeping views of the bay, and the satisfaction of sleeping under the roof he coveted. He was projecting his own shallow desires onto me. He was spending tens of thousands of dollars to barricade the front door, fiercely guarding the physical piece of paper that said his name was on the property line. It was a classic red herring. He was so distracted by the aesthetic symbol of wealth that he forgot how real estate actually works. In the historic preservation industry, we have a saying about century-old mansions. The deed tells you who bought the paint, but the land trust tells you who owns the dirt. A deed is just a piece of paper transferring surface rights. It means very little if the structural foundation sits on leased soil. Grandpa Harrison was a man who built his empire during the ruthless tech boom of the 1980s. He never handed over an asset without retaining a mechanism of control. I closed the invoice and navigated away from the corporate expense logs. I logged into the public records database for the Marin County Assessor. I bypassed the standard residential search parameters and dug straight into the commercial parcel maps. I typed in the coordinates for the Tiburon estate. The initial search result displayed exactly what Richard expected everyone to see. The deed was registered to Richard Jones. But I did not stop there. I traced the parcel identification number backward through 30 years of municipal tax filings. The digital breadcrumbs led me away from the residential deed and into the complex, interlocking web of Harrison Heritage Group subsidiaries. The paper trail revealed a brilliant, hidden corporate nesting doll. Richard owned the physical structure of the house, but he did not own the ground beneath it. The 2 acres of prime coastal real estate were permanently held by Pacific Coastal Holdings, a minor subsidiary branch tucked deep inside the blind trust. And I now legally controlled that blind trust. I pulled up the original foundational documents for Pacific Coastal Holdings. Buried in a digitized folder from 1998, I found the true mechanism of my grandfather's control. It was a commercial master lease. When Richard married Beatrice and demanded a grand estate to entertain his new high society friends, Grandpa did not write him a blank check. He leased the land to Richard on a strict 30-year term. The contract stipulated an annual ground rent, alongside a binding requirement that the tenant must cover all municipal property taxes. I cross-referenced the master lease requirements with the county tax records and the corporate ledger Evelyn provided. The math did not lie. Richard had not paid the ground rent in 4 years. Furthermore, he was delinquent on the county property taxes for the exact same duration. He likely assumed Grandpa was too old to check the subsidiary ledgers, or he simply believed the debt would vanish the moment he inherited the parent company. The irony was so sharp, it felt physical. Just 3 days ago, Richard stood on the manicured driveway of that estate, looked down his nose at my discounted clothes, and evicted me. He told me I was a charity case with no place in his home. He tossed my belongings onto the lawn as if he were a feudal lord banishing a peasant. Yet, according to the undeniable legal documents glowing on my laptop screen, Richard was nothing more than a delinquent tenant. He was occupying property that belonged to my trust, and he was in severe, inexcusable financial default. I sat in the dim light of the motel room, listening to the ocean wind rattle the thin glass window. I was no longer the discarded outcast crying on the sidewalk. By virtue of the master lease and the subsidiary transfer, I was legally Richard's landlord. I held the sole authority to terminate his occupancy. He was spending $40,000 to defend a house that sat on land he had forfeited the right to occupy. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the direct line to Pacific Century Bank. Evelyn Reed answered on the first ring, her tone as crisp and professional as ever. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told her I found the Pacific Coastal Holdings master lease from 1998. I relayed the tax delinquency and the 4 years of unpaid ground rent. I could hear the faint sound of Evelyn typing rapidly on her keyboard as she verified my findings in her own system. When she finished typing, a rare note of genuine approval entered her voice. She confirmed the delinquency. She stated that under California commercial real estate law, the tenant was in breach of contract, and the trust possessed the immediate right to initiate asset forfeiture. She asked if I wanted her to dispatch the bank's legal team to file the standard eviction paperwork with the county clerk. I looked at the trash bag still sitting in the corner of my motel room, filled with the wrinkled remains of my life. I remembered the sound of my mother's antique porcelain vase shattering against the concrete. I gripped the phone tighter. I instructed Evelyn to draft the formal notice of default, utilizing the most severe commercial terminology available. I told her to prepare the documents, but to hold them at the bank. I explicitly ordered her not to mail them and not to send a process server. I wanted to hand-deliver the eviction notice myself. Evelyn agreed, promising the drafted paperwork would be ready for my signature by tomorrow morning. I hung up the phone, feeling a profound, quiet shift in the balance of power. I finally possessed the leverage to force Richard to the negotiating table on my terms. I stood up to grab my coat, planning to buy a decent cup of coffee to celebrate the discovery. But before I could reach the door handle, a heavy, rhythmic pounding echoed against the exterior wood. It was not the polite knock of a housekeeper. I peered through the scratched peephole. A man in a cheap windbreaker was standing on the walkway, holding a thick stack of legal documents, sealed with a gold-embossed court stamp. Richard had made his next move, and the countdown to my financial ruin was officially underway. The rhythmic pounding on my motel door shattered the quiet focus I had built. It was a forceful, demanding sound. I walked over to the scratched peephole and looked out. A man wearing a cheap gray windbreaker stood on the concrete walkway. He held a thick stack of documents bound by a heavy blue legal folder. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. He did not ask for my name or offer a polite greeting. He simply shoved the heavy stack of papers into my hands. The top page bore a gleaming, gold-embossed seal from the California Superior Court. The man turned on his heel and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the outdoor corridor. I stood in the doorway, staring at the thick binder. The chill of the ocean breeze washed over me, but the cold settling in my stomach had nothing to do with the weather. Richard made his next move. I retreated into the dim motel room and dropped the binder onto the laminate desk next to my laptop. The cover page was titled An Ex Parte Application for an Emergency Injunction. I flipped through the dense, single-spaced paragraphs. Richard hired one of the most ruthless litigation firms in San Francisco. The motion formally requested an immediate, comprehensive freeze on the Harrison Heritage Group Blind Trust. His legal team argued the transfer of assets should be invalidated due to elder abuse and undue influence. My adoptive father attached sworn affidavits to support his vile claim. One statement came from Beatrice, detailing fictitious accounts of me isolating my grandfather. The second affidavit was far more dangerous. It was signed by a private concierge physician, a doctor known for catering to the whims of the Silicon Valley elite. This doctor claimed Grandpa Harrison suffered from severe cognitive decline and advanced dementia during the final year of his life. It was a fabricated lie. My grandfather was sharper than a tack until his dying breath. Just 2 weeks before he passed, he sat in his hospital bed and executed complex commercial real estate trades on his tablet. He debated municipal zoning laws with his nurses. But the justice system often prioritizes the appearance of authority over the truth. The presiding judge saw a sworn statement bearing the signature of a licensed medical professional. Based on that fabricated medical record, the court granted a temporary restraining order. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the direct line for Evelyn Reed at Pacific Century Bank. She answered on the second ring, her usually crisp voice strained and tense. She informed me that the bank received the electronic court order 10 minutes prior. Pacific Century Bank possessed no choice but to comply with federal banking regulations. Every single account tied to the blind trust was locked. Evelyn could not disperse funds, she could not authorize corporate actions, and she could not execute the notice of default for the Tiburon estate. My administrative authority as the majority shareholder was stripped away pending a full judicial review. The powerful weapon I just unearthed in the county tax archives was rendered entirely useless. The immediate reality of the financial freeze set in quickly. I opened the banking application on my phone to check my personal checking account. I had $300 remaining. I needed basic supplies to survive the weekend. I grabbed my keys and drove to a discount grocery store a few miles down the highway. The aisles were narrow, smelling faintly of overripe produce and cheap floor wax. I placed a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a bag of generic coffee beans on the conveyor belt. The cashier, a tired-looking teenager, scanned the items and announced the total. I swiped my debit card through the machine. The terminal emitted a harsh, flat beep. The screen flashed a red declined message. I frowned, assuming it was a chip error, and tried a different credit card. The machine beeped again. Declined. Richard and his litigators cast a wide, unforgiving net. They petitioned the court to freeze any personal accounts remotely associated with the estate beneficiary, citing a fabricated risk of capital flight. I stood under the flickering fluorescent lights, feeling the impatient stares of the customers waiting in line behind me. The heat of humiliation crept up my neck. I muttered a quiet apology to the cashier, left my meager groceries sitting on the counter, and walked out into the cold parking lot. I possessed a corporate portfolio valued at $114 million, yet I could not afford a single slice of bread. I knew I could not afford a corporate litigator to fight the injunction. Instead, I drove my rusted Corolla into downtown San Francisco and parked near a legal aid clinic situated in a rundown commercial strip. The waiting room was crowded with exhausted people holding worn manila folders. I sat in a hard plastic chair for 4 hours until a clerk called my name. I was directed to the cramped office of a public defender who specialized in civil disputes. He looked overworked, rubbing his tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses as I handed him the gold-embossed binder. He scanned the legal motions, his expression growing grimmer with every turned page. He sat back in his chair and explained the brutal, unforgiving math of the American justice system. He told me that justice usually favors the party who can afford to keep the billing meter running. Richard was executing a classic war of attrition. My father did not need to prove the dementia claim in a trial right now. He only needed to drag the legal process out until I ran out of oxygen. To fight the injunction, I had to file a formal legal response, depose the corrupt private physician, and hire independent medical experts to refute the fabricated medical records. The attorney stated that mounting a defense of that magnitude required tens of thousands of dollars in upfront retainers and court filing fees. I looked down at my hands. I had exactly 36 cents floating in the bottom of my purse. The public defender pointed to a date stamped in bold ink on the final page of the court order. He told me I had exactly 14 days to submit my legal response to the judge. If I failed to meet that 2-week deadline, the court would enter a default judgment in favor of the plaintiff. The blind trust would be permanently dissolved. The corporate assets would revert to the previous will, granting Richard full, undisputed ownership of the entire empire. The exhausted lawyer offered a sympathetic sigh. He told me I was trying to fight a corporate titan while wielding a plastic sword. He gently suggested I swallow my pride, call Beatrice, and accept the meager settlement offer she presented yesterday. It was the only way to avoid ending up homeless on the streets of San Francisco. I left the clinic and drove back to the Daly City Motel. The sun began to set over the Pacific Ocean, casting long, dark shadows across the concrete walkways. I sat in my car with the engine turned off, staring at the blank screen of my phone. A morbid curiosity guided my thumb to open the social media application. I navigated to Olivia's public profile. She had just posted a new story update. The screen displayed a glossy, high-resolution photograph taken inside a Michelin-starred restaurant overlooking the bay. 2 crystal flutes of vintage champagne clinked together over a plate of imported white truffles. The caption beneath the image read, "Celebrating truth and protecting our family legacy." Richard and Beatrice were celebrating their victory. They believed they successfully cornered the scapegoat. They assumed the financial freeze broke my spirit, just as it would have broken theirs. They viewed money as the sole source of strength and leverage in the world. So taking it away guaranteed a swift, pathetic surrender. They expected me to call them, begging for a handout, before the weekend was over. They fundamentally misunderstood my character. I grew up in the dark corners of their shadow, never relying on their wealth to define my worth. I learned how to survive on my own merits, building a career and a life long before they locked the iron gates of the Tiburon estate. I walked out of my car and entered the stale air of the motel room. I looked at the worn leather bag sitting on the sagging bed. Inside that bag were the forged vendor contracts I pulled from the construction trailer and the notes detailing the Tiburon master lease. My administrative authority was temporarily frozen, but the physical evidence of Richard committing federal crimes remained securely in my possession. I realized I did not need to hire expensive lawyers to argue over fabricated medical records in a civil courtroom. I needed to bypass the traditional legal system entirely. I had to force my adoptive father onto a battlefield where his money and his high-priced litigators could not protect him. I had 14 days to spring a trap that required no filing fees. It only required precise timing and undeniable proof. I sat on the edge of the sagging motel bed, the reality of my situation closing in like a physical weight. The corporate freeze locked away my resources. The digital smear campaign destroyed my professional reputation. My adoptive father successfully cornered me using the vast machinery of his wealth, executing a strategy designed to force a quiet, desperate surrender. I looked around the dim room. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, emphasizing the stark difference between my current reality and the $100 million empire resting on a frozen piece of paper. The exhaustion seeped into my bones. The temptation to call Beatrice, to accept the miserable allowance and disappear, was strong. It offered an immediate escape from the crushing pressure. I reached into the small cardboard box resting on the laminate desk. It contained the few personal items I managed to salvage from my desk at the appraisal firm, alongside a handful of trinkets I grabbed from the Tiburon estate before the iron gates locked me out forever. My fingers brushed against cold metal. I pulled out a vintage 1940s Hamilton pocket watch. It belonged to Grandpa Harrison. He carried it in his vest pocket every single day, long before he owned glass skyscrapers in Silicon Valley. The gold casing was scratched, dulled by decades of use, a stark contrast to the flashy, diamond-encrusted watches Richard and Olivia flaunted. I turned the heavy timepiece over in my palm, feeling the steady, rhythmic ticking vibrating through the metal. I traced the intricate engraving on the backplate. As my thumb pressed against a specific groove near the hinge, a mechanism clicked. The backplate popped open. I frowned, expecting to see the delicate interlocking gears of the mechanical movement. Instead, nestled snugly against the brass casing was a tightly folded square of cream-colored stationery. I carefully extracted the paper, my hands shaking slightly. I unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable, featuring the sharp, deliberate cursive strokes Grandpa used when signing major commercial contracts. The date at the top of the page indicated he wrote this letter exactly 2 months before his passing. The letter was addressed directly to me. He wrote that if I was reading this, Richard had shown his true colors, and the machinery of the estate was likely turning against me. Grandpa confessed that he spent years watching from the sidelines. He saw the way Beatrice sneered at my clothes. He witnessed Olivia excluding me from family photographs. He noticed Richard treating me like an unfortunate obligation rather than a daughter. He apologized for not stepping in sooner, explaining that protecting me within the house would only make their resentment stronger. He wrote that he chose me to inherit the holding company not because of obligation, but because of observation. He watched me build a career without asking for a dime. He saw me authenticate history, while the rest of the family obsessed over shiny, modern illusions. He penned a sentence that hit my chest with the force of a physical blow. He stated that blood is merely an accident of birth, but loyalty is a conscious choice. He instructed me to break them before they broke the company, trusting that I possessed the structural integrity they lacked. A single tear escaped my eye, landing on the corner of the stationery. The profound validation washed over the despair, dissolving it completely. He knew. He saw the quiet humiliation I endured, and he planned this corporate transfer to grant me the ultimate leverage. The words on the page triggered a vivid memory, transporting me back to a rainy Tuesday afternoon when I was 14 years old. I was standing in Grandpa's private workshop behind the main estate. He was restoring a seemingly beautiful Victorian writing desk Richard had purchased at an expensive auction. The desk gleamed under the fluorescent lights, coated in a thick, glossy finish. Richard bragged about the exorbitant price tag all week, showing it off to his high society friends as a pristine, historical artifact. Grandpa Harrison stood next to the desk, holding a small, butane blowtorch. He ignited the flame, casting a harsh blue light across his weathered face. He looked at me, his eyes sharp and focused. He told me to watch closely. He passed the intense heat of the flame quickly over a section of the glossy wooden surface. Almost immediately, the shiny top layer blistered, warped, and began to peel away in ugly, jagged strips, revealing cheap, synthetic particle board underneath. He turned off the torch and pointed to the exposed damage. He explained that a cheap veneer always peels when you apply heat. The initial appearance might fool a casual observer, but true authenticity can withstand pressure, while fakes crumble the moment the temperature rises. He placed his heavy hand on my shoulder and told me to remember that physical reaction when dealing with fake people. He said if you want to know what someone is truly made of, you do not look at their polish. You apply heat. I blinked, the memory fading back into the stale air of the motel room. The message was clear. I was acting like a victim, allowing Richard and his high-priced litigators to dictate the temperature of the room. They filed the injunction. They froze the assets. They launched the digital smear campaign. They were applying the heat, and I was absorbing it, contemplating surrender. I wiped the tear from my cheek. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing resolve. I carefully folded the stationery and placed it back inside the golden casing of the pocket watch. I snapped the back plate shut, sealing the mechanism. The rhythmic ticking echoed in the quiet room, sounding less like a timepiece and more like a countdown. I was not the discarded outcast begging for scraps. I was the legally appointed majority shareholder of $100 million empire, personally selected by the founder. My adoptive family was a cheap veneer. Their wealth, their social standing, their entire corporate narrative was built on stolen pension funds, fabricated medical records, and unpaid ground rent. Richard thought his money made him invincible, but he was standing on a foundation made of rotting particle board. I walked over to the desk and opened my leather bag. I pulled out the forged vendor contracts I retrieved from the abandoned construction trailer. I reviewed the fraudulent notary seals and the routing numbers tracing the embezzled funds directly to Tiburon Holdings, LLC. I looked at the notes detailing the delinquent master lease on the Tiburon estate. I possessed the heat. I just needed the right environment to apply it. I picked up my cell phone. I did not dial Beatrice to beg for an allowance. I called the public defender who specialized in civil disputes. The tired lawyer answered, sounding surprised to hear my voice so soon. I told him I did not have the funds to mount a massive defense against the injunction right now. However, I asked him to utilize the state's procedural rules regarding emergency ex parte applications. Under California law, a plaintiff asserting a claim based on sworn affidavits must make the affiant available for formal questioning by the opposing counsel. I instructed the public defender to file an immediate demand for a deposition. I wanted Richard placed under oath on the official legal record, answering questions about his fiduciary duties as the acting chief executive officer. The lawyer hesitated, warning me that deposing a corporate titan without a war chest was a dangerous gamble. He said Richard's litigators would coach him flawlessly, and the maneuver would likely yield nothing but aggressive objections. I thanked the lawyer for his concern, but my tone left no room for debate. I told him to file the demand before the courthouse closed. I did not need to win a legal argument about fabricated medical records. I needed Richard sitting in a sterile room, overflowing with his own arrogance, assuming he was untouchable. I needed him to swear, under penalty of perjury, that his financial management of the holding company was pristine. Because the moment he uttered that lie, the civil dispute over an inheritance would transform into a federal criminal trap. The pieces were moving into position, and I was ready to strike the match. The public defender was right about one thing. Deposing a corporate titan without a massive war chest was a dangerous gamble. It required me to step onto a battlefield where Richard controlled the terrain. He spent his entire career in boardrooms and legal proceedings, mastering the art of the confident evasion. But the public defender did not know what I carried in my worn leather bag. He did not understand that I was not trying to win an argument. I was setting a stage. 3 days later, the trap was ready. We met at a sterile, fluorescent-lit law office in downtown San Jose. The room was aggressively modern, featuring glass walls and a sprawling slate table that felt more like an interrogation slab than a conference desk. My lawyer sat beside me, looking nervous, shuffling through his thin stack of standard procedural questions. Across the table sat Richard, flanked by 2 high-priced litigators whose suits likely cost more than my first car. Richard looked impeccable. He wore a charcoal gray jacket and a subdued silk tie, perfectly projecting the image of a responsible patriarch forced to endure the erratic behavior of an ungrateful child. A court reporter sat at the head of the table, fingers hovering over a stenography machine, ready to capture every syllable. The deposition began. Richard's lead attorney, a sharp-looking woman with severe glasses, established the baseline facts regarding Grandpa Harrison's health. Richard played the grieving son flawlessly. He spoke in low, measured tones, expressing profound sorrow over the fabricated dementia claim. He expertly dodged any direct contradictions, relying on vague phrases like memory lapses and periods of confusion. My public defender tried to press him on the timeline of the medical records, but Richard's litigators aggressively objected to the form of every question, creating a dense wall of legal interference. I sat silently, watching the performance. I did not interrupt. I did not show anger. I simply placed my hands on the table, resting my fingertips casually on top of a thick manila folder. I had written a specific label across the tab in bold black marker. It read, Tiburon Holdings Wire Transfers. I positioned the folder perfectly in Richard's line of sight, just an arm's length away. It was a test of his arrogance. In my line of work, determining the authenticity of a historic piece often requires assessing what the seller chooses to ignore. A guilty person avoids looking at the evidence, while an arrogant person simply believes the evidence cannot possibly exist. Richard fell squarely into the latter category. He was so blinded by his own superiority, so convinced that a public defender and a discarded stepdaughter posed zero threat, that he never bothered to look down at the table. He never read the label resting right under his nose. He assumed he was untouchable. The line of questioning shifted from my grandfather's health to the financial stewardship of the Harrison Heritage Group. This was the critical juncture. In a civil dispute over an inheritance, exaggerating a medical condition might result in a slap on the wrist or a dismissed claim. However, misrepresenting the financial management of a corporate entity while under oath constitutes perjury. It transforms a family argument into a federal crime. My public defender cleared his throat, reading from the prepared list I provided him that morning. He asked Richard to define his role as the acting chief executive officer regarding the oversight of subsidiary construction projects. Richard leaned back in his plush leather chair, adopting a tone of patronizing patience. He stated that his primary responsibility was ensuring the fiscal integrity of all ongoing developments, authorizing capital expenditures, and guaranteeing that vendor contracts were executed properly. The lawyer nodded, looking down at his notes. He asked if Richard had faithfully managed those subsidiary accounts over the past 4 years. Richard did not hesitate. His voice was firm, projecting absolute certainty. He said, yes. The lawyer pressed further, moving into the specific trap I laid out. He asked Richard to state, for the official record, whether he had ever authorized the transfer of corporate funds to any entity in which he held a personal, undisclosed financial interest. He asked if Richard had ever used company money to cover personal debts, fund private lifestyle expenses, or pay contractors who did not perform active labor on Harrison Heritage Group development sites. The room grew very still. The only sound was the soft, rapid clicking of the court reporter's machine. Richard's lead litigator shifted slightly in her chair, a brief flicker of concern crossing her features. She recognized the precise, dangerous nature of the question, but she could not object. It was a direct, relevant inquiry regarding his fiduciary duties. Richard looked across the table at me. He offered a cold, dismissive smile, the kind of smile he used when tossing my belongings onto the wet driveway. He believed I was desperately fishing for a discrepancy I could never prove. He looked directly at the court reporter and formally denied the accusation. He stated, under penalty of perjury, that every single dollar spent under his tenure was allocated to legitimate corporate operations. He swore he never used company funds for personal use, and he categorically denied the existence of any shell companies or fabricated vendor contracts. He finished his statement, reached for a crystal glass resting near his elbow, and took a slow, smug, self-satisfied sip of water. He savored the moment, believing he had just crushed my final, pathetic attempt at a defense. He thought he drove the final nail into my coffin. I did not argue. I did not object. I did not pull the forged construction permits out of my bag and slam them onto the slate table. My grandfather taught me that a cheap veneer peels when you apply heat, but you must let the heat build before you expose the damage. By speaking those specific lies on the official, notarized record, Richard crossed a line he could never uncross. He committed a federal felony in a room full of witnesses with his own expensive lawyers documenting the act. My public defender looked at me, raising an eyebrow, silently asking if I wanted him to push harder. I gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. He gathered his thin stack of papers, tapped them against the table, and formally requested a recess. Richard's litigators immediately agreed, eager to wrap up the proceeding they considered a massive waste of time. Richard stood up, adjusting his silk tie. He looked down at me, his expression radiating pure contempt. He told me I was wasting my time, and he warned me that the legal fees for this little stunt would be deducted from whatever miserable allowance Beatrice might still be willing to offer. He turned and walked out of the conference room, confident he had won the war. He did not realize the war was already over. I remained seated, my hand resting gently on the manila folder labeled Tiburon Holdings Wire Transfers. The trap was sprung, and the jaws were locked tightly around his ankles. I did not need to fight the injunction in a civil courtroom anymore. I possessed the undeniable proof of his embezzlement, and now I held his sworn, perjured testimony denying it. The combination was lethal. But presenting that evidence in a quiet lawyer's office lacked the necessary impact. Richard needed to be confronted on his own terrain, in front of the people who validated his existence. He needed his polished illusion shattered in the most public forum imaginable. I packed the folder into my leather bag and walked out of the building. The annual Silicon Valley Developers Gala was scheduled for the following evening. It was the premier social event of the season, a glittering showcase where the wealthy elite gathered to celebrate their dominance. Richard and Beatrice would be there, basking in the admiration of their peers. It was the perfect environment to apply the heat, and I had exactly 24 hours to ensure my name was on the guest list. I had exactly 24 hours to secure my position inside the Silicon Valley Developers Gala. This was not a public event where anyone could buy a ticket. It was an exclusive fortress built by the wealthiest real estate tycoons in California. Richard and Beatrice treated this annual gathering as their personal coronation. They used it to project an illusion of infinite prosperity. I needed to walk into their fortress and shatter that illusion. Getting past the velvet ropes required institutional leverage. I picked up my phone and called Evelyn Reed. As the senior wealth manager handling the Harrison Heritage Group accounts, Evelyn possessed undeniable authority within those circles. The bank was a platinum sponsor of the gala. controlling a prominent VIP table near the main stage. My legal title was frozen by the court injunction, but I was still the designated majority shareholder on paper. Evelyn bypassed Richard and registered my name as the primary corporate delegate representing the trust. My next challenge was my appearance. I was unemployed, my bank accounts were frozen, and my credit cards declined at discount grocery stores. I could not afford a new designer gown. But as a historic property appraiser, I spent 6 years cataloging estate sales, examining textiles, and studying the structural integrity of vintage garments. 3 years ago, I attended a liquidation auction in San Francisco and purchased a flawless 1950s emerald green silk dress for $80. The fabric possessed a heavy, luminous quality that modern fast fashion factories could never duplicate. The tailoring was meticulous, designed to project quiet power rather than loud desperation. I paired the emerald silk with simple gold earrings inherited from my late mother. I brushed my hair back into a sleek twist. When I looked in the mirror, I did not see a discarded scapegoat. I saw the rightful heir to a legacy. I ordered a standard economy rideshare to the Fairmont Hotel. The grand entrance was chaotic, overflowing with luxury sedans, stretch limousines, and a swarm of local society photographers. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed to open doors for tech billionaires and urban developers. My driver pulled the modest, dented hybrid vehicle right to the curb, stopping directly behind Richard's chauffeured black car. I stepped out of the back seat. The cool evening breeze caught the heavy emerald silk, making it ripple like dark water. I smoothed the fabric and walked toward the grand marble staircase. Beatrice was standing near the velvet entrance ropes, posing for a photographer from a prominent lifestyle magazine. She wore a tight, silver-sequined gown that caught the flash of the cameras. She tilted her head, practicing her perfect, hollow smile. Then she turned her gaze toward the curb. When Beatrice saw me ascending the marble steps, her jaw literally dropped. The professional photographer snapped the shutter, immortalizing the pure shock contorting her features. The silver sequins suddenly looked cheap compared to the timeless structure of the emerald silk. Beatrice excused herself from the camera crew and rushed to intercept me near the coat check. She blocked my path, her eyes darting around the lobby to ensure no one was watching. She leaned in close, her perfume suffocating and sweet. She hissed under her breath, demanding to know what I was doing there. She called me a disgrace and a trespasser. She threatened to summon the hotel security team to have me thrown out onto the street. I did not raise my voice. I did not shrink away from her anger. I stood perfectly still and looked down at the heavy diamond pendant resting against her collarbone. I recognized the piece. I spent the last few days studying Evelyn's corporate ledgers. I knew Richard used the subsidiary accounts as collateral to secure the loan for that exact necklace. I smiled, maintaining cool, steady eye contact. I told Beatrice to enjoy wearing it tonight because the collateral on that piece expired on Tuesday. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and wide-eyed. She stumbled backward, her hand flying up to clutch the diamonds, as if I were about to physically rip them from her neck. Her practiced social armor cracked, exposing the terrified debtor hiding underneath. I stepped around her frozen figure, handed my trench coat to the attendant, and walked through the heavy wooden doors into the grand ballroom. The space was a masterpiece of opulence. Towering floral arrangements decorated every table, and crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden light across the room. Waiters carrying silver trays of champagne navigated through crowds of the most powerful figures in Northern California. I scanned the room and spotted Arthur Vance. Arthur was the senior chairman of the Harrison Heritage Group Board of Directors. He was a pragmatic, numbers-driven veteran who commanded immense respect. He was currently standing in a tight circle with two prominent urban developers, discussing commercial zoning regulations. Olivia's viral video painted me as a greedy, unhinged monster who preyed on a dying grandfather. If I walked up to that circle looking frantic, defensive, or angry, I would validate her digital lie. Instead, I approached the men with the calm, measured confidence of a seasoned professional. I walked up to Arthur and extended my hand. I introduced myself not as Richard's estranged daughter, but as the new majority shareholder of the Harrison Trust. Arthur looked startled. He clearly expected me to be hiding in shame after the internet mob attacked my character. He hesitantly shook my hand. The two developers stopped talking and stared at me. I did not mention Olivia. I did not complain about the smear campaign or the frozen bank accounts. I simply joined their conversation. I offered a sharp, insightful critique regarding the new commercial grading permits they were discussing. My years of analyzing structural integrity, municipal codes, and historical foundations allowed me to speak their language fluently. I cited specific zoning precedents and offered a unique perspective on optimizing land use in the South Bay District. The developers were intrigued. Arthur's hesitant posture relaxed. These men were astute business veterans who valued competence above all else. They spent 20 minutes speaking with me about interest rates, foundation laying, and market trends. They quickly realized the person standing before them was not the hysterical, manipulative villain portrayed on social media. They saw a woman who understood the core mechanics of their industry. Olivia's digital smear campaign melted away under the heat of face-to-face reality. The fake tears of a lifestyle influencer held zero weight against genuine corporate fluency in a room full of people who valued capital over aesthetics. I reclaimed my social standing without firing a single defensive shot. Across the ballroom, I saw Richard and Olivia watching me. Olivia held a crystal flute of champagne, her knuckles white from gripping the stem too tightly. She looked panicked. She realized her hundreds of thousands of internet followers could not protect her in a room where actual power was leveraged. Her digital kingdom was useless here. Richard looked like he was suffocating. He watched me shake hands and share quiet laughs with the men who controlled his professional fate. The illusion of his undisputed dominance was fracturing in real time. He always controlled the family narrative by keeping me locked out of the room. Now, I was standing in the exact center of it, and the spotlight was shifting toward me. The gala was a resounding social victory, but social victories do not unfreeze bank accounts or pay grocery bills. The legal injunction was still actively bleeding my resources. But I noticed something crucial as the evening progressed. Richard spent exorbitant amounts of money to project supreme wealth tonight, but the structural rot was catching up to him. I watched him check his cell phone every 5 minutes. His face grew paler with each incoming message. He was sweating despite the cool air conditioning. The facade was cracking, and the immense financial pressure of his hidden debts was reaching a boiling point. The weekend was almost over. Monday morning was approaching, and the true cost of his desperate spending was about to trigger a catastrophic chain reaction that he could not stop. The weekend was a glittering facade built on borrowed time. Monday morning brought the brutal, unforgiving reality of corporate accounting. Richard sat at the head of the primary conference table inside the Harrison Heritage Group headquarters. The expansive glass windows overlooked the San Francisco skyline, offering a view he always believed he commanded. Today, the towering glass felt more like a cage. His tailored suit looked rumpled. His expensive silk tie hung loosely around his neck. The confident patriarch who threw me onto the street just days ago was rapidly unraveling. On the sleek surface of the boardroom table, his smartphone vibrated. It was a harsh, unrelenting buzz that shattered the quiet tension in the room. Richard stared at the glowing screen. The display showed 5 missed calls from his secondary creditors. These were not traditional banking institutions. When my adoptive father drained the company pension funds to fuel his private shell company, he still needed liquid capital to maintain his wealthy lifestyle. He borrowed heavily against his anticipated inheritance, utilizing shadow lenders who specialized in high-risk, short-term bridge loans. Those particular lenders did not send polite reminder letters when they felt insecure. They executed margin calls. A margin call requires a borrower to deposit immediate, liquid funds to cover the minimum value of an over-leveraged account. Richard owed millions. His lawyers, the same high-priced litigators who filed the emergency injunction against my trust, sat around the table looking grim. The lead attorney pushed a printed financial notice across the polished wood. The notice stated that a single, unknown entity had quietly purchased all of Richard's fragmented secondary debt over the weekend. This hostile buyer consolidated the outstanding loans and triggered a catastrophic margin call early this morning. Richard was legally obligated to produce the cash by noon, or the buyer would begin seizing his personal assets, starting with the Tiburon estate. Richard slammed his fist onto the table, the sound echoing sharply against the glass walls. He demanded to know the identity of the buyer. He paced the length of the room, shouting at his legal team, asking how a hostile takeover of his personal debt could happen without a single warning. His lawyers had no answers. They were experts in family court and probate law, not subterranean corporate finance. Richard picked up his phone, his fingers trembling as he prepared to beg his wealthy friends from the gala for an emergency loan. He never made the call. The heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom swung open. I walked into the room. I wore a sharp, structured charcoal suit, leaving the vintage emerald silk from the gala behind. This was not a social event. This was an execution. Evelyn Reed walked one step behind me, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. She projected the quiet, lethal authority of a seasoned wealth manager who had navigated decades of corporate warfare. Richard froze, his phone hovering inches from his ear. His lead attorney stood up, pointing a silver pen in my direction, stating this was a closed meeting and demanding we leave the premises immediately. I ignored the lawyer. I walked directly to the opposite end of the long table and took a seat. Evelyn remained standing near the door, a silent sentinel, ensuring no one left. Richard sneered, his voice trembling with a potent mixture of rage and exhaustion. He told me my trust was frozen pending a federal investigation, and I had no business standing in his building. Evelyn stepped forward and opened her briefcase. She did not raise her voice. She simply stated that Pacific Century Bank possessed every right to occupy the room. She handed a single sheet of paper to Richard's lead attorney. Evelyn explained that Grandpa Harrison anticipated Richard's ultimate reliance on shadow lenders. My grandfather embedded a specific financial mechanism deep within the bank's operational mandate. On Friday evening, acting upon my direct authorization as the legal beneficiary, Pacific Century Bank utilized its vast capital reserves to quietly buy up every single cent of Richard's secondary debt. The color vanished from my adoptive father's face. The hostile buyer was not a nameless corporate raider. It was me. I owned his debt. I triggered the margin call. I was the creditor holding the executioner's axe over his personal finances. His expensive lawyers reviewed the single sheet of paper, their expressions turning ashen. They realized they were outplayed on a board they did not even know they were playing on. I opened my worn leather bag. I did not boast or gloat. I kept my movements precise and deliberate. I pulled out the thick manila folder labeled Tiburon Holdings Wire Transfers. I slid it across the smooth wooden surface. It glided effortlessly, stopping directly in front of Richard. I instructed him to open it. Richard hesitated, his hand shaking as he flipped the cover open. The first document was the forged construction permit from the abandoned tech campus in San Jose. The second was the bank routing ledger, proving the money funneled directly into his private shell company. The third was the official court transcript from his deposition just 3 days ago. I watched his eyes scan the pages, watching the realization dawn on him. I told him he should have read the label on the folder during the deposition. I broke down the sequence of his failure without raising my voice. I explained that stealing from the employee pension funds was a severe crime, but doing it through a fabricated vendor network constituted federal wire fraud. Furthermore, sitting in a room with a court reporter and swearing under oath that his financial stewardship was pristine elevated the entire situation to criminal perjury. The arrogant patriarch was gone. Richard collapsed back into his plush leather chair, the air escaping his lungs in a ragged, defeated wheeze. His lead attorney quickly closed the folder, recognizing the lethal nature of the evidence staring them in the face. The lawyer advised Richard to remain completely silent. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and delivered the terms of his surrender. I told Richard he had exactly 2 options. Option 1 involved me walking out of the building and handing the folder directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The federal prosecutors would freeze all his remaining personal accounts, indict him on multiple felony counts, and ensure he spent the next 2 decades in a minimum security prison. Option 2 required his immediate, unconditional capitulation. I laid out the terms clearly. He would resign as the chief executive officer, effective immediately. He would withdraw his ridiculous emergency injunction against my trust before the courts closed today. He would surrender any and all claims to the Harrison Heritage Group, including the Tiburon estate. Finally, he would sign a comprehensive, legally binding confession detailing his embezzlement scheme, which I would keep locked in the bank vault as an insurance policy against any future retaliation from him or Beatrice. Richard stared at the forged documents, his chest heaving. He was trapped, stripped of his wealth, his leverage, and his polished illusion. He looked at his expensive litigators, hoping for a miraculous legal loophole, but they averted their eyes. They knew a sinking ship when they saw one. But Richard possessed one final, desperate card to play. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and let out a hollow, broken laugh. He told me I might own his debt, but corporate bylaws required a formal vote to remove a sitting executive. He sneered, stating the board of directors still answered to him. He vowed he would burn the entire empire to the ground before he handed his title over quietly. He forced my hand, guaranteeing that the final battle would not happen in the shadows. It would happen under the bright lights of the boardroom, in front of the very people he swore to protect. Richard pushed his chair back from the polished mahogany table, the leather scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in sharp, jagged rhythms. He looked at me, a wild, desperate energy replacing his earlier defeat. He reminded me that owning his personal debt did not automatically grant me the keys to the corporate kingdom. He was technically correct. My grandfather was a brilliant architect of corporate governance, and he built the Harrison Heritage Group bylaws to withstand hostile takeovers. Those bylaws contained a specific, unyielding supermajority clause. The chief executive officer could only be removed by a 75% vote from the board of directors or by a formal criminal conviction. Richard sneered, his confidence briefly returning as he clung to that legal technicality. He declared that he still commanded the loyalty of the board. He claimed those men and women owed their fortunes to his leadership, and they would never vote to oust him based on the accusations of an estranged, disgruntled stepdaughter. He vowed to fight me in that boardroom, confident he could spin the forged documents as a massive administrative misunderstanding. He thought he could survive the storm by relying on the polished relationships he spent decades cultivating. I did not argue with him. I simply looked at my watch. It was 11:30 in the morning. I informed Richard that he was right about one thing. Removing him required a formal vote, which was exactly why Evelyn Reed summoned the entire board of directors for an emergency session, scheduled to begin in precisely 5 minutes. Richard's eyes widened. He turned to his lead attorney, demanding to know how a meeting could be convened without his authorization. The lawyer looked down, avoiding his gaze, stating that a majority shareholder possesses the unilateral right to call an emergency session. The trap was not just sprung. The steel jaws were completely locked. The heavy doors opened, and the 12 members of the board of directors filed into the room. These were the titans of Silicon Valley real estate. I recognized Arthur Vance from the gala, alongside several other prominent figures who had previously dismissed me. They took their seats, looking bewildered by the sudden summons and the tense atmosphere radiating from Richard. Beatrice and Olivia entered quietly behind them. Richard must have called them in a panic earlier that morning, hoping their presence would project an image of family unity. Beatrice looked pale, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Olivia clutched her expensive handbag, looking annoyed that her morning routine was interrupted. Arthur Vance, the senior chairman, called the meeting to order. He looked at me, then at Richard, asking for the purpose of this unprecedented gathering. I stood up from my chair at the end of the table. I did not raise my voice, but the acoustic design of the boardroom carried my words clearly to every corner. I formally introduced myself as the legal beneficiary of the Harrison Heritage Group Blind Trust, and I stated my intention to invoke the supermajority clause to immediately remove Richard Jones from his position as Chief Executive Officer. A murmur rippled across the table. Several board members scoffed, exchanging skeptical glances. Richard stood up, adopting his familiar posture of the besieged, righteous leader. He appealed directly to his colleagues, calling my motion a ridiculous, vindictive stunt. He reminded them of the viral video, painting me as a greedy opportunist trying to steal a dying man's legacy. He asked them to dismiss the motion and throw me out of the building. I did not engage in a shouting match. I walked over to the digital control panel mounted on the wall and dimmed the lights. The massive presentation screen descended from the ceiling. I connected my laptop and projected the first document. It was not a forged permit. It was the detailed bank ledger tracking the employee pension funds. I pointed a laser pointer at the screen, guiding their eyes to a specific, recurring outbound transaction. Every single month for the past 4 years, Richard authorized a $25,000 wire transfer from the corporate treasury. I clicked to the next slide, revealing the destination of those funds. The money flowed directly into a private shell account registered to Olivia's lifestyle brand. The board members stared at the screen, the murmurs dying instantly. This was not an administrative error. This was blatant, documented theft. Richard was funding his daughter's fake online empire using the retirement savings of the company's workforce. I looked over at Olivia. She was staring at the screen, her mouth slightly open. She always claimed her business was entirely self-funded, a testament to her independent entrepreneurial spirit. The illusion shattered in front of the most powerful people in her father's circle. I did not give them time to process the shock. I clicked to the next slide. I displayed the master lease for the Tiburon estate alongside the county tax records proving 4 years of severe delinquency. I explained that Richard was occupying property owned by the trust while deliberately defaulting on his financial obligations, placing the subsidiary holding company at massive risk of municipal foreclosure. Richard tried to interrupt, his voice rising in panic. He claimed the tax records were a mistake, a clerical error he intended to rectify. He was grasping at straws, desperately trying to patch the holes in his sinking narrative. I ignored his outburst and projected the final piece of evidence. I displayed the forged construction permits from the abandoned San Jose Tech campus, side by side with the routing numbers, proving the embezzled millions were funneled into Tiburon Holdings, LLC. I explained the forensic analysis I conducted using the UV light, exposing the fake notary seals. The silence in the room was absolute. The board members, previously loyal to Richard, visibly recoiled in horror. They realized they were sitting at a table with a man who was actively destroying the foundation of their shared wealth. Have you ever seen the exact moment a narcissist realizes they have lost their audience? It does not look like anger. It looks like pure, unadulterated terror. Richard looked around the table, searching for a single sympathetic face. He found none. The men and women who previously laughed at his jokes and attended his lavish galas were now staring at him with undisguised disgust. The polished veneer was completely burned away, exposing the pathetic, greedy core underneath. To ensure the final nail was driven deep, I pulled a small digital audio recorder from my pocket. I placed it on the table and pressed play. The pristine acoustics of the boardroom amplified the recording of Richard's deposition. His own voice filled the room, arrogantly swearing under penalty of perjury that he never used company funds for personal use, and formally denying the existence of any shell companies. The recording ended. I looked directly at Arthur Vance. I informed the board that they could either execute the supermajority vote right now, or they could explain their inaction to the federal prosecutors when I handed this undeniable proof of wire fraud, embezzlement, and perjury to the authorities. Richard's lead attorney stood up abruptly. The lawyer did not attempt to defend his client. He recognized a terminal legal scenario. He leaned down and whispered fiercely into Richard's ear, explaining that a board vote was the least of his problems. If the federal government indicted him, he would lose everything and spend the rest of his life in prison. The lawyer slid the capitulation documents I drafted earlier that morning across the table. He explicitly ordered his client to sign them immediately. Richard stared at the paper. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the silver pen his lawyer pressed into his palm. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a toxic mixture of hatred and absolute defeat. He signed his name, officially resigning from the company, surrendering his shares, and withdrawing the emergency injunction. In the corner of the room, a different kind of panic was unfolding. Olivia was frantically tapping the screen of her smartphone. She realized the tide had completely turned, and the viral video she posted accusing me of elder abuse was now a massive, documented liability. She was desperately trying to delete the post, hoping to erase the evidence of her digital smear campaign before the consequences caught up with her. I turned my attention toward her. I did not raise my voice, but my words cut through the tense silence of the boardroom. I informed Olivia that deleting the video was a waste of time. I announced that my legal team formally archived the footage, the captions, and the subsequent engagement metrics. I told her the video constituted textbook defamation, and since her primary source of income was just exposed as stolen corporate funds, she would need a very good lawyer to handle the impending civil suit. Olivia froze, her phone slipping from her trembling fingers and clattering onto the floor. Beatrice buried her face in her hands, realizing the luxurious, insulated life she built was completely destroyed. The family that threw me onto the street was now stripped of their power, their wealth, and their social standing. The boardroom was mine. But signing a piece of paper did not undo the eviction I suffered. They needed to experience the exact same physical reality they inflicted upon me. 7 days passed since the corporate hierarchy surrendered inside the executive boardroom. I spent my first week occupying the corner office, working alongside Evelyn Reed to stabilize the Harrison Heritage Group treasury. We halted the bleeding, secured the pension funds, and fired the predatory litigators Richard hired to execute his hostile legal maneuvers. The corporate transition was swift and sterile, but my personal ledger still contained one unresolved entry. Signing a piece of paper in a downtown glass skyscraper did not undo the physical humiliation I suffered. My adoptive family needed to experience the exact reality they forced upon me. On Tuesday morning, I finalized the default clause for the Pacific Coastal Holdings master lease. Under California commercial real estate statutes, a tenant who severely defaults on ground rent forfeits the right to occupy the premises. The trust owned the dirt beneath the Tiburon mansion, and Richard had not paid for that dirt in 4 years. I signed the official writ of possession and handed it to the municipal authorities. The law required the property to be vacated immediately. The Marin County fog rolled heavily off the bay, mirroring the weather on the afternoon of Grandpa Harrison's funeral. I drove my 12-year-old rusted sedan up the winding coastal roads, navigating the familiar route to the estate. When I reached the property line, the towering wrought iron gates stood wide open. 2 white sheriff cruisers sat parked on the pristine circular driveway. Their red and blue light bars flashed rhythmically, reflecting off the damp concrete and the grand colonial columns of the front portico. I parked my car on the street, near the exact spot on the curb where I sat crying just a few weeks ago. I stepped out into the crisp ocean breeze and leaned against my driver's side door. 2 uniformed deputies stood near the entrance, holding clipboards and observing the eviction process. Because I froze their financial accounts and seized their corporate credit cards, Richard and Beatrice could not afford to hire a luxury moving service. They could not secure a fleet of padded trucks to carefully transport their curated lives. They were reduced to utilizing whatever materials they could find inside the house. The heavy mahogany front doors opened, and the poetic justice unfolded with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Richard walked out first. He looked aged, stripped of the tailored boardroom armor that previously defined his entire identity. He was hauling 2 heavy-duty black plastic trash bags over his shoulders. The bags bulged awkwardly at the seams, filled with his custom Italian suits and expensive leather shoes. Beatrice followed close behind him. She stumbled slightly on the wet pavement, wearing impractical designer heels while dragging her own oversized plastic sacks. The sharp corner of a luxury handbag box poked through the thin black material, ripping a jagged hole and spilling silk scarves onto the damp driveway. She scrambled to pick them up, her face flushed with deep, inescapable humiliation. Olivia trailed behind them, her arms full of loose cosmetics, tangled charging cables, and haphazardly folded cashmere sweaters. The visual symmetry was flawless. They were carrying their discarded belongings in the exact same garbage bags they used to pack up my life. The universe possesses a remarkable sense of balance when you allow the truth to dictate the terms. Richard dropped his heavy loads onto the edge of the driveway, pausing to catch his breath. He turned his head and spotted me standing near the bumper of my old car. His posture stiffened. The sight of me standing there, comfortably observing his degradation, ignited a desperate spark of his old arrogance. He marched down the concrete path toward the street, stopping just a few feet away from me. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest. He accused me of destroying his legacy. He claimed I took everything he worked for, stripping his family of their dignity and their home out of pure, vindictive spite. He wanted me to feel guilty for enforcing the rules he spent his entire life breaking. I looked at him, feeling no anger, no sorrow, and no lingering fear. I kept my voice cool and steady, ensuring the deputies could hear the exchange. I told Richard I took nothing. I explained that I simply stopped paying for his lies. I reminded him that the house, the money, and the social standing were always illusions funded by my grandfather's genius and the stolen retirement savings of hardworking employees. He built a kingdom on leased dirt, and the lease simply expired. Richard lowered his hand, the last remnants of his fake authority dissolving into the coastal fog. He turned his back to me and walked slowly toward his pile of trash bags. Olivia stood near the grand staircase, watching her father retreat. She was always the golden child, insulated from consequence, conditioned to believe the world existed merely to serve her aesthetic desires. She dropped her plastic sack onto the wet concrete. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her smartphone. If her family could not win the legal war, she intended to win the digital narrative. She planned to exert her remaining leverage by broadcasting her eviction to her 400,000 loyal followers, weaponizing their sympathy to launch a fresh wave of harassment against me. She held the phone up, framing her face against the flashing lights of the sheriff cruisers. She tapped the icon for her social media application, preparing to record a live broadcast detailing her victimization. I watched her screen from a distance. The application opened, but the familiar grid of highly curated photographs did not load. Instead, the screen flashed a stark white error message. It read, "Password incorrect." Olivia frowned, tapping the screen aggressively. She typed her credentials into the login fields, her thumbs flying across the glass surface. The system rejected the attempt. The red error notification pulsed on her screen again. She tried to initiate a password reset, requesting an authentication link to her primary email address. The phone alerted her that the recovery email was no longer recognized by the network database. Panic seized her features. She looked up from her device, her eyes wide and frantic, scanning the driveway until she locked eyes with me. She demanded to know what I did to her network access. She screamed that her brand was her personal property, and hacking into her digital platform was a federal offense. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I did not smile, but a profound sense of satisfaction anchored my response. I informed Olivia that nobody hacked into her account. I explained the fundamental principles of corporate law regarding intellectual property and brand asset allocation. When Richard utilized the holding company treasury to fund her lifestyle brand, he unknowingly entangled her digital footprint with the corporate infrastructure. He used Harrison Heritage Group capital to pay for her marketing teams, her server hosting, her product development, and the very smartphone she was currently holding. Under standard commercial statutes, any asset developed using stolen corporate funds belongs legally to the parent corporation. I told her my legal team filed the asset reclamation paperwork yesterday afternoon. The Corporate Information Technology Department contacted the social media platform directly, providing the legal documentation proving the holding company held the rightful ownership of the brand. The platform complied with the corporate mandate. They transferred the administrative rights, revoked her access, and changed the password at midnight. I looked at her trembling hands. I stated that the 400,000 followers, the verified handle, and the digital empire she used to orchestrate my public smear campaign were now officially registered as corporate assets. I legally repossessed her influence. She was reduced to zero. Olivia stared at me, the reality of her total erasure sinking in. The internet kingdom she prized above human decency was gone, reclaimed by the very siblings she tried to destroy. She dropped her arms to her sides, the smartphone slipping from her grip. She had no audience left to manipulate, no sponsors to fund her escape, and no stage left to perform on. I turned away from the shattered remnants of my adoptive family. I walked back to my rusted Toyota Corolla. The car possessed faded paint and a dented bumper, but I owned it free and clear. I opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. I started the ignition, the engine humming to life. I looked through the windshield one last time. Richard, Beatrice, and Olivia were huddled together on the wet curb next to a dozen black plastic garbage bags. The sheriff deputies instructed them to wait off the property line. Because Richard's luxury vehicles were leased under the corporate entity, the bank impounded the sedans earlier that morning. The former royalty of Silicon Valley real estate stood shivering in the ocean wind, waiting on the sidewalk for a budget rideshare they could barely afford. I shifted the car into drive, pulled away from the curb, and did not look back in the rearview mirror. 6 months passed since the heavy mahogany doors of the executive boardroom closed on my former life. The air inside the chief executive officer suite now smells of cedar and fresh ink, a stark departure from the stale tension Richard always left in his wake. I sit behind a sturdy oak desk. It is an authentic 19th century piece I sourced from a historic estate in Monterey. I tolerate no cheap veneers in this office. The desk is solid wood, built by craftsmen who understood how to construct something capable of withstanding the relentless pressure of time. On the corner of the polished surface rests Grandpa Harrison's vintage pocket watch. The gold casing catches the morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The rhythmic ticking fills the quiet room. It is a steady, reassuring sound, a daily reminder that time moves forward and the deepest wounds eventually heal. When I took control of the Harrison Heritage Group, the corporate ledgers were bleeding. The rot my adoptive father introduced threatened to collapse the entire financial structure. I spent the first 90 days working alongside Evelyn Reed to stabilize the foundation. My first official directive involved restoring the employee pension funds. The capital Richard funneled into his private shell company was recovered during the federal audit. We returned every stolen dollar to the rightful accounts. The foreman, the architects, and the administrative staff received their full retirement savings, plus a standard yield interest adjustment to compensate for the delay. Earning the loyalty of the board was a strategic necessity, but earning the trust of the workers who actually built this empire was my true achievement. I refused to merely manage sterile tech campuses or soulless retail complexes. I merged my expertise as a historic property appraiser with my grandfather's real estate legacy. Our company established a new, heavily funded division dedicated to historical preservation across California. We acquired distressed heritage properties, stabilized their aging foundations, and restored their original architectural integrity. We repurposed those neglected buildings into community centers, local libraries, and affordable commercial spaces for regional artisans. Our current flagship project is the revitalization of an abandoned theater in downtown San Francisco. Richard planned to demolish the structure to build another generic glass tower. I reviewed the blueprints, visited the site, and halted the demolition crews. The building featured original Art Deco plasterwork and a foundation of solid granite. It just needed someone willing to invest the patience required to peel back the layers of grime. Walking through the dusty auditorium last week, surrounded by scaffolding and the hum of restoration crews, I felt a deep, resonant connection to my grandfather. He built this corporate machinery, but he handed me the keys because he knew I would use his resources to build things that matter. He taught me how to find the value hidden behind peeling paint, and now I use his empire to ensure those buried treasures are never torn down by men who only care about a quick profit. The people who threw me onto the street are navigating a very different reality. The universe corrects its balance not through vindictive revenge, but through the natural consequences of broken character. Richard avoided federal prison by signing the comprehensive confession and surrendering his remaining assets to settle his shadow debts. He relocated to a dusty, fading suburb in Nevada. He secured a position as a mid-level consultant for a regional logistics firm. My former adoptive father sits in a gray, windowless cubicle, answering to supervisors half his age. He is stripped of his tailored suits, his chauffeured sedans, and his towering corner office. He possesses no corporate power and commands no respect from his peers. Beatrice did not follow him to Nevada. The illusion of wealth was the only adhesive holding their marriage together. When the money vanished, her devotion evaporated. She moved into a cramped guest room in a modest house owned by her older sister. This is a sister Beatrice spent the last 2 decades mocking at exclusive country club luncheons. Beatrice now spends her days clipping grocery coupons and suffering the quiet indignity of living under a roof she does not control. Olivia experienced the most profound awakening. Her digital empire was legally reclaimed and liquidated to satisfy the corporate debts. Devoid of her stolen funding, she had to seek traditional employment. She manages a mid-tier retail clothing store in an outdoor shopping center. She stands on her feet for 8 hours a day, folding sweaters, organizing inventory, and dealing with impatient customers. She no longer curates a flawless online existence. She is forced to navigate the unpolished reality of the actual world. I often think back to the afternoon of the funeral. I remember sitting on the wet concrete, staring at the garbage bags holding my life, feeling an unbearable sense of rejection. I spent 20 years trying to earn a place at a dining table where the chairs were always pulled away. I believed my lack of shared DNA was a fundamental flaw, a permanent stain I could never wash out. I bent over backward to accommodate their cruelty, hoping my quiet compliance would eventually be rewarded with basic human affection. I equated their proximity to security. Navigating the corporate war and dissecting their financial fraud taught me a vital lesson about human nature. The absence of shared DNA was not the reason they rejected me. They rejected me because my presence acted as a mirror, reflecting the hollow reality of their own lives. Richard possessed a billion-dollar portfolio, but carried the constant, suffocating fear of a fraud waiting to be exposed. Beatrice wore expensive diamonds to mask her profound insecurity. Olivia bought digital followers because she lacked genuine human connections. They functioned as parasites, feeding on the legacy of a man they never truly understood. When Richard looked at me, he saw a woman who understood structural integrity. He saw someone trained to spot a fake. That was the real reason I was exiled from the Tiburon estate. I sit in the quiet warmth of my office. The morning fog burns off over the bay, revealing a bright, clear sky. I pick up the vintage pocket watch and run my thumb over the engraved brass casing. The rhythmic ticking is a testament to quality craftsmanship. It is a daily reminder that true value endures, while cheap imitations inevitably shatter on the pavement. I look around the room filled with architectural blueprints and ledgers proving the ethical prosperity of this company. I built a new life not by seeking revenge, but by refusing to participate in their delusion. They told me I wasn't blood, like it was a curse. They didn't realize it was my greatest protection. Blood just means you share DNA. Family means you share respect. If you have ever had to build your own table because you were denied a seat at theirs, drop a heart in the comments. You are the architect of your own worth. We live in a culture profoundly obsessed with the curb appeal of our lives. In the relentless pursuit of the American dream, it is so easy to fall into the trap of manicuring the front lawn while completely ignoring the slow, creeping dry rot festering behind the pristine drywall. We want the Ivy League stickers on the back of our luxury SUVs, the perfectly curated holiday card photos, and the outward assurance that we have succeeded as parents and providers. But when the storms come, and they always do, a house is not held up by a fresh coat of expensive paint. It is held up by its structural integrity. The saga of Calantha Jones, her adoptive family, and the $100 million empire hidden within a blind trust is far more than a satisfying tale of corporate revenge. It is a profound, modern parable about parenting, family responsibility, and the terrifying consequences of raising children with a sense of entitlement rather than a foundation of character. At its core, this story asks us to examine what we are truly passing down to the next generation. For parents navigating the complexities of modern American society, where social premiums are often placed on wealth and status, the tragedy of Richard and Beatrice serves as a stark warning. They were masters of the polish. They hosted high society galas, wore designer clothes, and bought into the illusion that their financial dominance made them untouchable. Yet, they were morally bankrupt, funding their opulent lifestyle through embezzlement and deceit. When we raise our children, we must ask ourselves, are we teaching them how to look successful, or are we teaching them how to be honest? True family education requires emotional awareness and the courage to instill fairness, even when it is difficult. If we prioritize the veneer over the load-bearing beams of integrity, empathy, perhaps the most deeply resonant lesson, lies in the concept of family itself. In traditional and blended families alike, we often grapple with the invisible lines of loyalty and biology. Richard's ultimate downfall was his archaic, narrow belief that being blood inherently gave his biological daughter Olivia the right to a luxurious life, while Calantha, his adoptive daughter, was a mere charity case who deserved nothing. But as Grandpa Harrison so wisely observed, blood is merely an accident of birth. Loyalty is a conscious choice. Family is not defined by shared DNA, but by shared respect, mutual support, and unconditional fairness. When parents fail to recognize the unique value of every child in their home, regardless of their origin, they breed a toxic environment of resentment. Calantha's story reminds us that emotional awareness in parenting means seeing your children for who they are and what they build, not just the genetic reflection you see in the mirror. We must also reconsider the concept of inheritance. What is the greatest gift a parent can leave behind? Grandpa Harrison left Calantha a massive corporate trust, but that was not his true legacy to her. His greatest gift was teaching her a trade. By mentoring her to become a historic property appraiser, he equipped her with a specialized skill, a relentless work ethic, and the ability to distinguish authenticity from cheap imitation. He gave her the tools to survive even when she found herself stranded on a wet curb with only $400 to her name. In an age where we are tempted to shield our children from every hardship, to buy their way out of adversity, we must remember that self-reliance is a far more secure inheritance than a trust fund. Equipping young people with tangible skills and the resilience to stand on their own 2 feet is the ultimate act of parental love. Conversely, the character of Olivia represents the tragic failure of modern parental indulgence. She is the cautionary product of an influencer culture funded by parental theft and shielded from natural consequences. Her digital empire was built on a foundation of sand, entirely dependent on her father's stolen corporate funds and a highly curated, fake aesthetic. We do our children a massive disservice when we fund their illusions and protect them from the accountability of the real world. When Olivia attempted to destroy Calantha's reputation with a fake tear, viral video, she was fighting a war of popularity. But Calantha did not engage in an unhinged digital shouting match. She relied on cold, hard paper, legal evidence, and the irrefutable truth. The lesson for young people today is incredibly clear. You do not need to win a popularity contest if you have the truth, the skills, and the receipts. Expertise and quiet competence will always outlast loud, empty noise. For any young person feeling marginalized, excluded, or overlooked within their own families or social circles, Calantha's journey offers a powerful beacon of hope. She notes that being an outcast was actually her greatest protection. It forced her to build her own table because she was denied a seat at theirs. Independence is a superpower. When you do not rely on someone else's iron gates to protect you, they cannot use those same gates to lock you out of your own future. You are the architect of your own worth. Success in America's true meritocracy should be earned through hard work, tangible competence, and unyielding authenticity. You must be load-bearing. You must be able to withstand the heat without your veneer peeling away. These are the stories that force us to look in the mirror and ask the difficult questions about who we are and what we are building. If you find yourself captivated by these deep emotional journeys of resilience, justice, and the ultimate triumph of character, I highly encourage you to follow and subscribe to the channel Sophia Revenge Stories. We explore the complex, sometimes dark, but always illuminating corners of family dynamics and personal vindication, bringing you narratives that resonate long after the screen goes dark. As we step back and view the canvas of our own lives, the story of the Jones family lingers in the quiet spaces of our minds. It invites us to walk through the hallways of our own homes and examine the foundations we have laid. Are we passing down a legacy of sturdy, authentic oak, or are we simply polishing a cheap veneer, hoping the heat never comes? When the grand galas end, when the digital screens go dark, and when the bank accounts are frozen, all that remains is the undeniable truth of our character. Listen closely to the quiet moments in your own living room. Is that the sound of a strong, unbreakable bond holding your family together? Or is it just the steady, rhythmic ticking of a pocket watch, counting down the seconds until the truth is finally revealed?